All right, let's get into this because it's a wild story. We're going to unpack how something as simple as everyday trash managed to ignite a major international dispute between the US and Canada, a crisis that went all the way to the Supreme Court.
Everything kicks off with this number right here, 3.46 million. That's how many tons of Canadian municipal solid waste, we're talking regular, everyday household garbage, gets trucked across the border and buried in Michigan landfills every single year. And to be clear, this isn't just a handful of trucks trying to save a buck. No, this is a massive, ongoing operation. It's created this huge, kind of lopsided relationship where Ontario is basically using Michigan as its go-to dumping ground. I mean, just look at the numbers. The Michigan Department of Environment found that this Canadian trash now makes up over 14% of all the garbage being disposed of in the entire state. That is a staggering figure, and you can see how it really set the stage for a major political fight. So, Michigan's governor, Gretchen Whitmer, looked at this situation, her state becoming the region's cheapest landfill, and decided to do something about it. She came up with what seemed like a really simple, clever economic fix. The plan? Jack up the state's landfill tipping fee, that's the surcharge for dumping trash, by an incredible 1,288%. The idea was to completely wipe out the financial incentive that made it so cheap for Canadian haulers to make that drive across the border. But, it's never that simple. There was a catch. A really fascinating and kind of tricky piece of U.S. constitutional law stood in the way, the Dormant Commerce Clause. In a nutshell, it says states can't just create their own protectionist laws that unfairly target goods from other places.
And because of that clause, the new fee couldn't just apply to Canadian trash. Nope, it had to be applied even-handedly to all trash, including the garbage from people living right there in Michigan. So the plan basically turned into a trash tax on Michigan's own families and businesses. And, well, you can imagine how popular that was. The bill stalled out pretty quickly in the state legislature.
So this is where the story really blows up, because this simmering state-level problem was about to crash right into a full-blown federal trade war. On February 1st, 2025, the Trump administration used a law called IEEPA to slap a 25% tariff on a bunch of Canadian goods. And all of a sudden, Canadian trash, which actually has its own official tariff code, 3825.10, was no longer just trash. It was officially a taxable good, caught in the middle of an economic war. This, as you can imagine, created a logistical nightmare. See, under the big trade deal, the USMCA, Canadian goods could get an exemption from the tariff. But, and this is a big but, to get it, you had to prove your cargo was wholly obtained in North America. Okay, so how on earth do you do that for a truck filled with mixed garbage?
I mean, you can just see how absurd this whole situation was. These rules of origin, they were written for things like cars or steel parts. They've got these super specific manufacturing terms in them, like drilling, painting, galvanizing. Trying to apply that to a truckload of banana peels and junk mail, it was completely, totally unworkable.
So this unprecedented mess, using municipal waste as a tool of foreign policy, it actually escalated all the way to the highest court in the United States. The case was called Learning Resources, Inc. versus Trump, and it challenged the very foundation of the administration's trade war. The argument was that the president didn't even have the authority under that IEEPA law to impose these kinds of tariffs in the first place. And, in a huge 6-3 decision, the court actually agreed. Chief Justice John Roberts basically said, look, the power to tax belongs to Congress, and you can't just hand that power over to the president through some vague emergency law. It was a massive check on executive power.
So the ruling killed that 25% tariff. And for a moment, it provided this sigh of relief for all the importers, including, of course, the garbage haulers who were caught in this crossfire.
But that relief, it was incredibly short-lived. I mean, we're talking literally just hours after the Supreme Court's decision came down, a brand new tariff popped up to take its place. The administration just immediately pivoted. They used a different law this time, Section 122 of the Trade Act, to impose a new 10% global tariff. This made sure that the economic pressure on the border kept going, and that this whole waste crisis was far, far from over. So what's the takeaway here? Even after this dramatic Supreme Court showdown, the fundamental problem was still there. For Canada, the U.S. border was still an unpredictable economic barrier, and that led to some pretty drastic countermeasures. Facing all this hostility and unpredictability, Ontario's Premier Doug Ford basically came out and said, that's it. We have to secure our own waste independence. We just can't depend on our American neighbors anymore.
And Ontario's response was aggressive. They fired back with a 25% surcharge on energy they were exporting to the U.S., and they passed new legislation, Bill 5, which was designed to fast-track building their own massive landfill sites by, get this, bypassing the usual environmental reviews. So this whole insane crisis, starting from a state fee dispute and ending in a Supreme Court battle, it really leaves you with this one big question. When something as basic as garbage becomes a weapon in a trade war, who are the ones who really end up getting dumped on? It's just a powerful reminder of how quickly our everyday world can get tangled up in a much, much bigger geopolitical game.